A light splits the darkness. A tone echoed through the small inn room, lively and jaunty. It seemed to almost mock the depressingly time-worn surroundings. A male form stirred, caramel skin emerging from beneath the blankets, hands lingering on the paler, smaller, sleeping form next to him as he groggily groped for his phone. Part of him wanted to dismiss it, but he promised he would always answer. He put the phone to his ear and mumbled out a half-awake acknowledgement. 2 muffled words shook him from his stupor immediately, and he sat up straight on the edge of the bed in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I'm on my way. Vergil como siempre. Can't catch a break, eh?
Clara kept her eyes shut, her breathing uninterrupted.
Slow and steady.
Though sleep had long abandoned her, though she had heard, she allowed a moment to settle, for him to end the call before she opened her eyes. She feigned drowsiness and confusion as if it were second nature.
Markus? What's going on?
Markus had set the phone aside and was in the middle of leaning over towards her when she spoke. He leaned in and caressed her face softly, fingers tracing her cheek as he pressed his lips against her forehead. But all she felt was a sense of dread.
I'm sorry, mi arma. There's an emergency at one of my jobs and they need me in. I gotta go.
He pulled a face of regretful distaste, one hand resting on her waist as he leaned in to kiss her lips slowly, affectionately. Dare she say, lovingly? He sighed as he pulled away.
Fuck. Que vamos de vuelta pa' allá. I'm on shift at the bar again tomorrow night. I'll make it up to you then.
And he slowly, almost as if hesitant to pull himself away from her, stood from the bed and began gathering his clothes to leave, much as he might wish he could stay. She pushed herself up on her elbows, bed sheets draped lazily over her waist and hair hanging tangled and disheveled over her shoulders. The cold was quickly infiltrating the warmth where he had once been. Panic idly simmered in her chest, twisting her stomach into knots, wondering if, somehow, she had done something to scare him away, made him want to flee and never look back.
No, it was just the cold. Okay. I'll see you.
Lame.
Lame, 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 lame!
He paused as he moved towards the door, looking through the gloom. He started back towards her, tipping her chin upward so he can kiss her again, quickly but softly.
Yeah, you will. You're my favorite customer after all.
She tried not to think too deeply or dwell too long on the implication of his words. He produced a t-shirt from his hand. He was going to have to buy more of those since somehow they kept going missing, and gently pressed it into her hands.
Keep it safe. It's my favorite. I'll be coming back for it.
Suddenly, she was overwhelmed. With a final wink and a lingering, perhaps longing look, he disappeared from the room, quietly closing the door behind him, making sure to leave those 10 euros plus some extra money for breakfast in her purse as he left, all before she could figure out what to say. And there, sitting on that cabinet, she realized, his car key was still there.
Wasn't it so funny how the allure of death evaporates the moment life is threatened?
Clara knew. Stepping outside the inn, the shape of a car key pressing into the palm of her hand, she knew. Walking across the empty parking lot, she knew.
Empty, save for one car, a bright red car, and I saw red through the windows.
Clara snapped herself out of a daydream.
Breakfast?
Perplexed by the sight of electric stoves and pots sitting atop well-used counters. For a moment, distracted long enough from the broad back and slender waist and glistening mocha skin that busied themselves with eggs and bread she wasn't sure how he had procured. Markus glanced back over his shoulder at her, lightly tossing his messy ponytail to one side.
Silken chestnut, burning garnet at the ends.
He gives her a saucy, playful wink, his topless form, clad only in an apron of dubious origin, flexed as he turned his waist on the spot to half-face her.
Well, yeah. I figured you'd need some energy after last night, mi arma.
He allowed his eyes to drag up and down her half-dressed form, over her legs and long, tousled hair, before returning his attention to the counter. Her rolling eyes were betrayed by the smile pulling across her lips.
Una disculpa. I would have cooked you breakfast before now, but, well, I'm a busy man. I have a rare morning off today, though. Lucky you, muñequita.
Her head was full of cotton, her mouth even more so. She was staring dumbly.
That I was certain.
Lacking the originality to form thoughts of her own.
Lucky me.
She echoed. Her focus was all over the place. The room, their clothes scattered on the floor. The black dragon inked onto his skin, coiling up his left arm.
Drat, I got distracted.
She blinked her eyes, pulled herself forcibly to the here and now, to the cramped inn room, and to Markus.
Says the man who couldn't wait until we got through the door, or out of the car.
Guilty as charged.
He shrugged his broad shoulders nonchalantly. She could picture the grin and the rows of pearly white teeth, even while he was turned away.
Not that I remember you complaining. You gonna come arrest me, oficial?
You don't leave me much of a choice.
Her hand reached for the closest article of clothing it could, determined to fix her state of undress. Not that it usually bothered her, especially when Markus was involved. The scent of him filled her lungs when she pulled the shirt over her head. It was far too big. His warmth filled her soul when she pressed against him from behind. She watched him work over his shoulder, chin resting happily on the base of his neck, cheek pressed into the crook of it. She felt his chest rumble with a pleased hum. She started, but wasn't sure where to proceed. How could she articulate the uncomfortable knot twisting in her stomach at the sight of a dozen eggs and a whole loaf of bread?
Can pay you back.
Her words sounded lame, even to her. He allowed himself a bemused half-chuckle, a wry twisting of his lips upwards. He would have preferred to make an omelet, but the ingredients available to him at that little corner store had been limited, and...
What was the point of an omelette without ham and peppers, eh?
The silence killed her. Eventually, his eyes fell on her in his too large shirt, and let out a low whistle of appreciation.
I might be inclined to say you wear it better than I do, Preciosa.
Another roll of her eyes, fond and oh so familiar.
And here I thought I looked my best without anything on at all.
Well then, you'll just have to model both for me, cariño. It's hard to imagine beauty like yours and do it justice.
He drew a laugh from her as easily as he breathed, even though she wondered the extent of how much he meant, if it was genuine or meant to draw a reaction, or a line that many others had been told before.
Distracted again.
She wondered if he knew.
He definitely knows.
He glanced back to the pan with a grin and a nod.
More pepper to be nice, but you work with what you can get.
He mused to himself before taking another forkful of eggs and turning around to face her. She played with the turn of phrase in her head. There was a metaphor in there that she wasn't certain she liked. He held the fork up to her lips as his free hand rested on her waist, pulling her gently towards him, hip to supple hip.
Markus.
She pressed, but her firm resolve was no match for his playful gaze.
I fully intend on you paying me back, mi zorrita. Immediately after breakfast,
he said, mischief twinkling in his eyes. The urge to roll her eyes was great, but the feeling of his touch, like fire, spreading warmth through her body and left her aching, was even greater.
Not before or even during? Do I even know you?
She was grinning.
Drat.
Unable to take her eyes off of him, his thoughtful gaze, the gentle slope of his nose and the plushness of his lips, permanently quirked upwards in a charming smile or challenging smirk, ever poised with witty remarks or sweet nothings that made her melt.
Don't give me ideas, Mr. Vries. I'm not sure the table could take it.
I wouldn't dream of it, Mr. Reiland.
She ate the forkful, then a plateful, then repaid his act of kindness with heated touches and happy endings. She still worried it wasn't enough. frozen in place, a deer in the headlights, stomach cold with the dread of the unknown, breath bated, watching the unrecognizable drift through the evening mist, mind breaking from failure upon failure to identify what it might be. The next moment, a deafening howl. She turned and ran. The world jolted to life with a skitter of claws and a jostled car behind her. She sprinted as hard as she could, taking as long a stride as her legs would allow. She tasted the irony on her tongue, coating her mouth like honey.
Thick and suffocating, making my teeth ache.
Her face was warmed by each exhale that blew right back onto it. The pavement was slick with frost and evening dew. She didn't know where she was going.
Inside. I need to get inside.
Just that she couldn't stop.
Don't look back. Not unless you want to die.
A deafening shriek, warbling, shifting uncannily to a ghoulish roar, raising the hairs on her arms, the back of her neck. Her stomach twisted and churned. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It wasn't natural. And whatever it was after her. The doors to the inn were right within her sight. The brass handles glinted invitingly in the lamplight. She outstretched her hand, ready to grab it. Her body hit the ground. Hard. The jagged edges of the key stabbed into her palm, lodged firmly in place, but having the air knocked so completely from your lungs, being made to lay with mouth agape and eyes wide, never got easier. The grip of cold, the bite of terror, being left so completely helpless. An impossible weight pinned down her back, keeping her from moving, from expanding her chest to breathe. A hot gust of air blew down the back of her head. She closed her eyes. Opening them, she stood before the bar where Markus worked, a place she had grown painfully familiar. Her hand was outstretched, in the middle of pushing the doors open. She wondered why she stopped. Clara took a deep breath, soothing her nerves and finding her courage. She stepped through. The bar was packed with university students and fishermen, like it normally was. Clara slid the meager 10 euros across the counter of the bar, almost as glad to be rid of it, as desperately as she needed it. His shirt was comfortable, the way it hung on her shoulders, tucked into her shorts. It still smelled just like him.
Any plans tonight?
She hadn't meant for it to come out the way it did, or what it implied, with her slipping him cash over the counter and strongly, blatantly suggesting that she desired his company yet again. She blushed an impressive shade of scarlet, and willed herself to evaporate on the spot. Markus turned his head to look at her, lifting a questioning eyebrow, and it was too late for her to evaporate now. He let out a soft clicking noise with his tongue, smiling at her gently. He doesn't know much about her personal life, and she preferred to keep things that way. But perhaps he knew more than she expected him to. He shook his head.
Clara, corazón, I said you didn't need to give me the money. Breakfast was a gift.
He slid the euros back across the bar with a smile, his other hand reaching out to play with a stray lock of her hair.
Drat. Distracted again.
If you want to pay me back, pull up a chair. I don't have any plans, but that could change.
But is that really enough? Is that all it took?
And maybe let me try to earn a smile, mi cielo. You have the most beautiful smiles in town. Me habéis embrujado.
Earn a smile. As if that was something you ever struggled to do. Markus, I'm serious.
She pushed the bill back into his larger, stronger hand, then clamped her own over it, keeping his fingers curled into his palm. He shook his head slightly, keeping her gaze held with his.
So am I. Your smile is all I need.
She wondered how many others he'd used that line on.
Not that it was my business. Not that it mattered at all. And especially not that it affected me any less.
However, he could tell he wasn't winning this one. He slowly took the money, though with a look in his eye that told her he hadn't given up just yet.
In that case, I'll make sure to repay you tonight.
He winked saucily, eyes tracing her face, fingers in her hair and cheek.
Your choice, what that means.
As he played with that same lock of hair, Her fingers traced the tendons that pulled taut on his wrist, knowing full well what it did to him.
Watching his skin pull tight against his muscles, flexing beneath my touch involuntarily.
Her eyes followed suit, flickering down to the network of veins beneath tight, coffee-colored skin, decorated by corded bracelets and brass, and a dragon painted in ink coiling up his arm.
Then, our usual place?
A dazzling smile crosses his face, his eyes roaming over hers, her silver hair, her lips, and then lingering on her eyes. He wrapped the satin strand of silver around his finger, a rumbling hum in his chest.
Our usual place? If I don't get impatient and have you right here, of course. 𝓥𝓸𝓬𝓮 𝓐𝓬𝓽.
That sounded more like him.
Careful though, cariño, or you might just get addicted to me.
Like he's fairly sure he felt the same.
And little did he know that I was no better.
His eyes flicked down to where she was still wearing his shirt, and he chuckled, leaning in for a slow, steamy kiss.
Yeah, you wear it much better than me.
Suddenly, she was crashing through the woods, one moment here, then gone the next. Something sharp tugged at her side, caught in flesh and fabric, stringing her along for the ride as she flew through the foliage. Her grip on Markus's car key was bone white. She slammed into something hard with incredible force, and she was torn free with a scream, flung to the side, and crumpled on the ground like a rag doll. Her vision grew blurry. It felt like hours, days, an entire century before her vision came back into focus again, but her mind was still reeling. Was this how it felt to have your life flash before your eyes? She was glad, at least, that she only remembered the good things. She felt her stomach growing warm, but not from the memories. Gingerly, she reached over and touched her side. It was damp and, indeed, warm. She breathed out shakily, but felt no pain. She clung to that chance, used it to move off her back, but the sudden rush of blood draining from her head put her back on the ground. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the sound of clashing metal. Instinctively, she clutched the metal in her palm tighter. She felt it bite into her skin, reminding her it was still there.
Clara!
Her grip on a soap-soaked plate slipping, sending it clattering to the floor in several dozen pieces. Her heart leapt in her throat and choked her. The sound of shouting, blazing fires, and scraping metal crashed into her all at once. Of ingredients and sauces she can't pronounce, and sharp knives rapping on cutting boards.
What the actual fuck, you incompetent fucking dumbass! Get your head of your fucking ass before I yank it out!
Clara met the gaze of the force of nature that was the head chef, Elias Wright, a man of pure muscle who towered over everyone he crossed paths with. In that moment, he looked like he was ready to knock her lights out. Dread seeped into her bones, locking her joints, freezing her in place.
You're a goddamn dishwasher, not a fucking dish breaker! Do your fucking job properly or take your fucking apron off and get the fuck out!
Her eyes remained stubbornly on her hands, empty and soap-covered. She breathed shakily.
Sorry, Chef. It won't happen again.
She dropped to her knees, instantly, gathering the shards in her hands, lip quivering, throat closing, choking.
Don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. Pick up the pieces, don't cry.
A growl under his breath, and then a deep sigh.
Just fucking leave it.
He stooped to retrieve a dustpan and brush. He towered over her like a mountain.
Tanner! Get your ass over here and clean this shit up. You're on dish duty. Try not to fucking ruin them like you ruin steaks.
He gestured for Clara to get up, and even when she did, the top of her head reached only his broad shoulders.
Clara, go take a break. Don't need you fucking cutting yourself on the plates, you hear? Go get some water and come back when you got your shit together.
Yes, Chef. Sorry, Chef. Don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. Pick yourself up, don't cry.
She felt the uneven ground beneath her hands, on her arm, scraping her knees. She leapt to her feet, one hand clutching at her side, the other clutching the cold of Markus's car key, and ran. She could barely see, and she wasn't sure if it was simply the darkness of night or her vision failing her.
What the hell even happened? Doesn't matter.
She was going to get out of there. wherever there was. Her mind was spinning, so she told herself not to think.
Just keep running. Just run and think later.
She followed the trail of carnage carved into the dirt and uprooted foliage, clinging desperately to the hope that it would lead her back to where she came.
However I got here.
She heard a loud crash behind her, forcing a surprised yelp from her lungs as she ran faster. She should have tripped and broken her ankle. She should have. There was no doubt that she would have, had it not been for the path carved into the forest by whatever had taken her there. Clara saw lights, warm and inviting. Her chest ached.
Yes!
Something crashed into her side, knocking her off course and shot a spiderweb of pain from her torn side. Pain so intense that everything went black.
You don't have a phone? Well, if you ever get in trouble, just send up a flare. I'll know it's you.
She stared blankly at the drink in her hand, her reflection staring back at her from the surface of the liquor. She seemed deep in thought.
Because a flare would be so much easier to get my hands on.
Markus laughed, and his voice rang clearly in her ears, even among the noise of a packed bar.
Ahem.
Clara blinked herself from her reverie, realizing that there was no one left in front of her at the library counter.
Good afternoon, miss. How may I help you today?
Sorry.
Her apology was half-hearted and lame. She stepped up to the counter with an embarrassed flush.
I'd like to use the computer, please.
The well-dressed man on the other side lifted an eyebrow, but said nothing. She could only assume he took her for another student who had pulled an all-nighter. That would have been a mercy. She half expected him to direct her to the books on time management, but instead...
Of course. How long are you intending to use it for?
She felt far away, taking in her surroundings for what felt like the first time. The well-organized books and modern interior design of the Bougainville University Library.
What are the rates?
The man at the counter nodded.
Are you a student at the university?
No, but I'd like to be.
He lifted an eyebrow and gave her an almost, not sympathetic, but reappraising look.
I see. Well, the rates are €5 an hour on the computers, or you could sign up for one of our Bougainville Library memberships. For only €15 a month, you are granted 3 free hours on our computers every day, and are allowed to borrow up to 4 books at any one time from our collection.
He paused, leaning in ever so slightly.
As a member, I could also sign you up for the university newsletter. You would get course updates, faculty interviews, information on upcoming scholarship schemes and competitions.
Clara bit back a wince. That was money she definitely could not spend. 1 hour on the computer was the cost of 1 meal she would be skipping. She fidgeted anxiously, mouth opening and closing without finding anything to say. She could afford to skip a meal.
Sure, I'll take an hour, please. Do you take extensions? Just in case?
She'll consider the membership once she knew what the future held. If she would still be around at all. An odd expression flashed across the man's smooth, handsome face.
Were librarians usually that attractive?
She wasn't sure what it was. Perhaps pity? Perhaps sympathy. He regarded her with an inspecting eye that made her incredibly self-conscious and aware of her disheveled state. Just as she thought he was about to turn her away, a glint of realization,
Or was it recognition?
twinkled in his eyes.
Recognition.
She wondered. He considered for a moment, then typed on the keyboard.
Why would you look at that? You are our 157th customer today. That qualifies you for a 1-month free trial membership to the library. How fortuitous!
He looked up at her, eyebrow raised. Her gaze snapped up, eyes wide.
Huh?
Her thoughts came later than her voice, as they normally did, spinning as they tried to comprehend what just happened.
157th.
She choked, suddenly. Her hand flew up and clamped firmly over her mouth. It was just a free trial. To library access, yet it still felt more than she had ever had in her entire life. A tear spilled down her face. Fuck.
I think that's my new favorite number.
After a moment, he retrieved a small disposable card, wrote something down on it, and slid it to her across the desk.
Second floor, room 207. Any computer should be acceptable. These are your login details. Your free trial expires precisely 31 days from now. If you would like to renew, simply ask whoever happens to be at this desk. I shall ensure a copy of the newsletter I mentioned is kept on hand for you to pick up each week, Miss.
Her hands were shaking when she took the card. She swallowed her feelings down and wiped her eyes. It wouldn't last long, so at the very least, she should try and hold off until she found somewhere no one would see her.
DeVries. Thank you, Mr. Bishop.
Her eyes fluttered open. Her body felt numb and heavy. Her chest seized, realizing that she was still there, on the forest floor, worlds away from where she wanted to be, where she was supposed to be, and that everything that had happened was real. She choked back tears.
Fuck!
She forced herself onto her feet once more, but she found it was a struggle to stay upright. Clara swayed on her feet, her bloodied hand catching a tree trunk, smearing crimson over its gnarled surface. The world was spinning around her. Her chest was tight, and no matter how many gulps of air she took in, none of it made it to her lungs. Her body trembled, her knees buckled, and her body crashed against the tree in a desperate attempt to stay upright. She was freaking out. Her heart was beating in her ears, overwhelming all her senses. She was bleeding. She was suffocating. Oh God, she was going to die. A ringing overtook her hearing, long and steady. As the remainder of her resistance fell away, she thought of that old piano in the thrift store, its melancholic tune. Another part of her thought about the mountains of notebooks, filled end to end with songs she'd never completed, sheet music she never played, the full Wright scholarship for Bougainvillea University's School of Music, one that would finally turn her life around.
But what are the chances they'd pick me? This is what you've been searching for. You have to try. Or everything you've been through would have been for nothing.
The rickety notes filled her delirious mind, surrounding her like a warm embrace. Evergreen trees. Her heart slowly steadied as her mind drifted away, leaving the cold, leaving the dark for somewhere bright, somewhere warm. She took a step. And if I could leave, Her fingers felt at home among the ivory keys, where they danced with certainty and grace. A bag sat by her feet, filled with unwanted clothes that had been left forgotten in the charity bin, and she was lost in her own world. On my little island, there's no one to please. No one can hurt me and nobody leaves. I won't be burdened, can't be insecure, and there's no one that I have to be. I sure won't be crying on my little island. Clara shambled through the darkness, moving as fast as she possibly could, yet lacking the urgency she had before. She meandered rather than rushed, drifting as opposed to flying. She felt oddly calm. Part of her wanted to sit, and she was no longer afraid to drift off to sleep and never wake. She gritted her teeth and kept pushing. The cold metal of the key bit into her palm as she went. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, pulling her to turn around. She came face to face with those blood-red eyes once again. Its massive mauve, terrifyingly sharp fangs were agape, drooling with dark saliva. Something metallic gleamed, caught between its massive rows of teeth. But she wasn't going to run this time. The beast looked different than the first time she saw it. Perhaps it was her foggy mind and memory troubles, but she could have sworn it looked smaller, more disheveled than before. Its head was held lower, its body unsteady, breaths shuddering. She saw herself in the creature for a split moment, reflected in its eyes. And in its eyes, she sensed that she was nothing but food. The beast charged forward, fangs flashing, saliva flying. She stumbled back, her body moving on its own as she kept her eyes trained on the beast.
Face it! Don't look away!
Through the rush of fear, of anger and sorrow and grief and stubbornness, hope and resignation, she found courage. Her hand grabbed at a heavy piece of wood and drove it between its jaws. The force knocked her backwards into the ground. Black dots filled her vision as she watched its razor-sharp fangs sink into the dense material with ease. Had that been her arm, she knew it would have been bitten clean off. Her arms trembled as she held that piece of wood in place, the only thing separating her from certain death. She heard the heart-wrenching noise of splintering wood. It was going to break. It was going to break, and then there would be nothing to stop those jaws from closing around her throat. In the grip of her right hand, the jagged metal body of Markus's car key caught her eye, stuck between her palm and the piece of wood. Blood rushed and screamed in her ears like a cacophonous roar. She had reached the crescendo, and there is no choice left but to lose yourself in it. She relinquished her grip on one end of the wood, letting it drive into her shoulder and dropping the jaws of death ever closer. She smelt the blood in its breath, held hers, and drove the key into the beast's eye. The creature lurched back, ripping the wood from her hands where it was still stuck on its fangs, and wrenched its eye free from the key. It turned and fled. The air was much lighter now, but it reeked of blood. Her lungs ached. The cold air burned as she gulped it down in mouthfuls. What just happened? Was she even alive still? Her hand remained clutched around her abdomen, where the dampness and warmth had grown cold and biting. Her legs were shaking, her knees wobbling, and it was evident that the only thing keeping her upright was the adrenaline still screaming in her veins, roaring. She never let go of the key.
His gory, bloodied key.
Digging viciously into her palm. Her long strides carried her across the parking lot of the run-down inn she had come to see as her haven, even long before this, long before tonight. Where was she going? Her room?
Yes.
There, she would be fine.
Oh God.
Was she dying?
Help. Please.
How was she still up, racing up the stairs to the second floor? Probably because if she stopped, she was going to...
Markus!
She choked, her voice strangled. He stood there, in front of the door to their...
My...
room.
I'm gonna be sick.
Markus stood in front of the door, hand raised to knock. His breathing was a little ragged, his demeanor a little hurried, anxious. But she knew he was trying not to show it. As his gaze landed on her, she could see his heart sinking in his chest, as his handsome face twisted in horror. He span around immediately.
Clara!
He shouted, louder than he'd perhaps intended, jolting her out of her stupor. He was already halfway towards her by the time the second syllable had left his lips.
Coño, que me habré de cagar en la... Clara, hang on.
Immediately, he was sweeping her into his arms, hands supporting her as he insistently picked her up off her feet. She felt that she was about to fall over, so she let him.
Clara, what happened?
I don't know. I couldn't process it even if I tried.
All that came out was a whimper. His eyes went over her body, his hand already clamping down as best as he could on the wound in her side.
Clara, hey, cariño, look at me. Don't close your eyes. Stay with me, okay? We're getting you to the hospital. Can you hear me? Where's the room key? In your purse?
In that moment, she felt like a dying fish, mouth gaping but not being able to form words. Her thoughts stumbled and tripped over themselves, jumbling together until nothing came out at all. All she knew were his warmth, his arms around her, his familiar scent and the way his chest rumbled when he spoke. Her eyes were wide and wild, watching his lips move, forming words that she couldn't hear. Her gaze trailed downwards to his bare chest. A glimmer of cognition passed through her.
Fuck! I ruined your favorite shirt.
He shook his head.
Que le den por culo la camisa. Never mind the shirt. Clara, the key. Where is it?
His favorite shirt. Ruined.
She stewed over the thought, clung to it like it was the most important thing in the world. She swallowed, thickly, like her tongue was swollen, useless in her mouth.
Key? Oh.
The reason she had gone out there in the first place. Into the dark, into the cold, the unknown. She unfurled her fingers, surprised at the amount of effort it took to do so. Her joints had locked up,
Almost.
curling back in on themselves without her willing them to. His keys had stamped their shape in her skin with gore and blood.
Yeah, you left your keys.
He blinked, then again, then shook his head.
Good. Saves us time.
He turned and immediately ran as fast as he could down the corridor, practically taking the steps 2 at a time. He tried to keep her stable, glancing down at her and whispering soft reassurances to her as he ran.
It's gonna be okay, Clara. You're gonna be okay. Just stay with me, okay? Don't worry about the shirt. I know a good recipe for getting blood out, and it's dark anyway, so it should be fine.
He reached the car park and barreled towards Baby, his bright red Pontiac Firebird, sitting blissfully close to the entrance. With the hurried precision of somebody who had done this more times than a bartender should, he bundled her gently into the passenger seat and slid across the hood to the driver's side. Tires squealed as Baby peeled out of the lot in a cascade of smoke and exhaust fumes.
Come on, Clara. Stay with me. I still have to make it up to you. I have a few new twists to evening bliss to show you, and you wouldn't want to miss those, right? And I have so many more shirts for you to steal, I mean borrow, so don't you go to sleep on me now, okay?
His voice was losing its usual smirk and swagger. Genuine fear, no, terror, bleeding in. Over the divide of their 2 seats, she laid her hand over his own, where it lay on the clutch. A gentle reminder and a reassurance that she was still there. Even if words failed her, music never did.
Wonder what it's like to stay for a while on my little island.
There were few cars on the road at this time, and yet still too many. He may have hopped a curb or two and ran a few reds, but frankly, tickets were the least of his concern as he barreled into the hospital parking lot, nearly knocking over a street lamp in the process. The trip inside was a blur, a mix of images and sounds and hammering heartbeats in his ears. Baby was left half on the curb and half pushed against a bush as he shoved his way shoulder first into the emergency room, almost kicking a small child out of the way as he hurtled into the waiting room.
¡Doctor! Get an hijo de puta doctor right here, now! Carajo!
Clara was starting to ache. Her eyelids grew heavy as the adrenaline slowly retreated. She caught bits and pieces, stolen moments that jumped from one to the next. One moment, Markus's frantic heartbeat. The next, the soothing yet authoritative voice of one of the nurses, distant and fading.
Come this way, sir. The doctor will be here soon.
She could feel Markus moving again. She felt the tremble in his hands as he lowered her to the cold, soft surface of a bed.
My name is Kirana. I'll be looking after you this evening, okay? I promise we'll do everything we can.
Clara released a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, hand curling over something metallic and pointy, something that poked into the skin of her palm. But she was sure that she had already given Markus his keys.